Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk About Cities, a podcast dedicated to making complex topics in architecture and urban design more accessible. In today's episode, we will talk about Red Vienna, starting by giving some historical background information and introducing the, at the time, revolutionary ideas that were implemented and are still relevant today. Furthermore, we will discuss how the projects were financed and also go into detail with the Karl-Marx-Hof as a well-known example for municipal housing in Vienna that still shapes the cityscape today.
Lastly, we'll talk about how the period of Red Vienna came to an end, in what way the development of municipal housing was continued with after World War II, and look at how municipal housing in Vienna works nowadays. I'm Matthias.
And I'm Katharina. We hope you'll enjoy today's episode.
Let's talk about cities.
So before we get to our main topic of today, Red Vienna, maybe Matthias, you can start to set the scene.
In 1910, Vienna was the capital of Austria-Hungary, an empire of 51 million people, and the city had slightly over 2 million inhabitants. For comparison, Paris had 2.8 million, Berlin had 2.1, and Moscow 1.6 million inhabitants. So it was really one of the biggest cities in Europe and, in fact, the entire world. It was a cultural and political hub, a metropolis of a great empire. In 1913, some of the future most important figures of the century lived in Vienna, like Sigmund Freud, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, Tito, and Hitler. And then came the war. The First World War, although it wasn't fought in Vienna, had a huge impact on the city. There were supply issues and high inflation, which together with the large number of refugees and wounded arriving in the city, led to a shortage of food and housing. Hundreds of thousands of people had to queue up in terrible conditions for their ration of bread or risk going hungry. The rising rents led to the first efforts to introduce rent control and protection against eviction. The Austrian Emperor Karl I and the German Emperor Wilhelm II met in August 1918, at the end of the war, to discuss how to go on. The Austrians wanted immediate peace negotiations with the Allied powers, but the Germans first wanted to improve their military situation in order to strengthen their position in the peace negotiations. A German offensive on the Western Front failed badly, and on October 26th, the Emperor Karl of Austria-Hungary ended the alliance with the German Empire and sent an offer of peace to the Allied powers. At the same time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was falling apart. Emperor Karl had written a manifesto on October 16th, offering the territories of the empire more sovereignty in a federal monarchy, a reform. But the manifesto was understood as an opportunity for self-rule, and on October 24th, Hungary reduced their union with Austria to merely sharing a monarch and no longer state institutions. On October 28th, Czechoslovakia declared their independence, and on December 1st, so did the kingdom of the Serbs, Slovenes, and Croats. On November 11th, Emperor Karl wrote a proclamation giving up his claim to participating in Austrian state administration. And the next day, the First Austrian Republic was declared. On November 13th, Karl wrote a proclamation for Hungary as well, and 3 days later, the Republic of Hungary was announced. And that was the end of the Habsburg monarchy.
And how did the situation look like in Vienna at that time?
Well, as I said, there was a lot of misery. During the war, the Municipal Council of Vienna was run by the Conservative Christian Social Party, and they would have to answer for the shortages of food and housing and the general misery of wartime Vienna. And there was also a revolutionary mood growing, partly because of these circumstances. And then on May 4th in 1919, there were the first free municipal council elections for women and for men, which was very early in European terms to also allow women to vote.
And how did that turn out?
Well, the Social Democrats achieved an absolute majority with 54% of the votes. And that majority would hold until the end of the so-called Red Vienna period. in 1934, and then also after the war continue.
Yeah. So I think that's important. I forgot to mention that before. If you refer to the period of Red Vienna, you're talking about the time between 1920 and 1934.
Yeah, precisely. And Vienna was at the time a municipality, but in the state of Lower Austria. Austria is a federal republic with a lot of sovereignty of the individual 9 states, the Bundesländer. And the election result meant that the Social Democrats also chose the governor of the state. For the Christian Social Party, this was unacceptable because Lower Austria with Vienna equaled about half of the entire nation's population. It was no longer an empire of 51 million. It was a small nation of about 7 million. Mm-hmm. And Lower Austria and Vienna together was about 3.3 million. And many of these voters outside of Vienna were largely conservative, farmers and so on. And they didn't feel represented by the Social Democrats and their policies. So the Christian Socials, which actually ran the government at the time of the nation, wrote in their proposal for the first constitution of the First Republic after the abdication of the emperor, or exile actually. In this constitution, they treated Vienna as a state of its own. It was separated from Lower Austria to let the Social Democrats have their homelands, or where they had the most voters, and then take Lower Austria with the farmers and the countryside under Christian social rule. And there were different attitudes to that within the Social Democratic Party, not necessarily for or against. Mainly what they wanted then was to be given a piece of the territory of Lower Austria, because the territory of Vienna, the city, was mostly the city. So they didn't really have, for example, land to grow food on. Mm-hmm. And there was still a food crisis even after the war had ended. Mm-hmm. So they wanted some land to grow food on. But that was refused. And the final constitution came into effect on November 10th, 1920. And Vienna was then a municipality and a state, but without changes to its territory.
So that was already because you said they didn't have any land to grow food on. Was that also when those wild settlements started, when people...
No, that started already before then.
Just as a...
That started during the war, just as a means of surviving, basically. But then also did continue throughout the period of Red Vienna, but became more and more organized, and also finally became officially recognized by the city government. Yeah,
I guess we'll cover that later. Yeah. I just didn't really know where it started, and I thought maybe around that time.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So a main point of Vienna becoming a state was that it actually made the entire Red Vienna period possible. Because as a state, not just as a municipality, Vienna had the right and the power to enact state laws, and also raise state as well as city taxes, and receive federal funding as a state and a city. And this gave them a lot of political power and financial power, but most importantly, the power to raise taxes of their own. So the taxes that made Red Vienna possible were called the Breitner taxes.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to tell us a bit about them.
Yeah, that's because Hugo Breitner was the city councillor for finance during the Red Vienna. And he was, I think, at the end of Red Vienna, he was the most hated politician or so, because he was really radical.
Could well be. Well, by the conservatives.
Yes.
Yeah, they had posters, for example, with him as he was also a Jew, so there was a lot of anti-Semitic hatred towards him. they had posters with him with like an exaggerated nose as the nidbilder of Jews at the time, grabbing the money from the people.
Yeah, I mean the tax that brought the most revenue was the welfare tax. It was paid by employers as 44% of the wages and salaries of the workers, as well as by the banks and bankers as 8% of their deals. I think one reason why he wasn't liked by many was that he introduced a tax on luxury foods or other luxurious goods, such as champagne, for example. So now I'm thinking about this one billboard or poster where he's taking away the champagne from the rich people, and then saying that the taxes on luxurious goods will help to finance other projects. Besides the already mentioned tax on luxury items, as well as the welfare tax, there was also the amusement tax that taxed events such as operas, concerts, theaters, cinemas, and sports event venues. But I guess the most known one is the house building tax. In many Gemeindebauten, and from now on, I think we will refer as municipal housing for that. But in Vienna, it's known as Gemeindebauten. It often says "erbaut aus den Mitteln der Wohnbausteuer," which means built with the means of the house building tax. And I think that really also gives an insight on how those taxes were used, but also with that it was kind of shown off, they were really proud of it.
Yeah.
And
kind of
nowadays,
paternalistic, saying, look what we made possible.
Yeah, they were really showing, okay, we have taken your money, but we have used it for that. And here is what results from all the money that you had to pay. But that was kind of the scene at that time. And still says that on the municipal housing nowadays.
Yeah, precisely. And the house building tax accounted for about a third of the investments in building the municipal housing projects. Yeah. Do you maybe want to tell us about that particular policy, or actually Red Vienna and its policies?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when you think of Red Vienna, you mostly think about municipal residential housing, but it really was so much more. There was a revolution through evolution. They had so many bold plans that they wanted to go through with. And one of them was, the situation after World War I was really bad. The hygienic situation was really bad. The people didn't have a proper education. The welfare system was bad. No one had proper living conditions. And so there really was a need for improvement. And so one of that was to put an emphasis on improving the social welfare, as well as a reform of education. And maybe I can firstly go into the improvement of the welfare system, because before it was mainly built up on church or other private institutions or charity. And Julius Tandler played a really important role there. And he proposed to replace the existing traditional system and kind of start a socio-political experiment by improving living conditions and especially targeting working class families with more children. And he wanted to have the same possibilities for even those working class families. And he did that by setting out a network of kindergartens, of counseling centers for mothers, but also parents who maybe were counseled in their marriage, for example, or also youth departments and adoption centers. So there was really a network of institutions that should help the families in all possible ways.
And how did they deal with the hygienic situation?
Yeah, that's another big topic because, so I think, first of all, it's important to know that before there was oftentimes not even running water in the apartments. So maybe you can quickly say like those basenas that we still see nowadays.
Well, I mean, the city had expanded rapidly in the 19th century, and similarly to Paris and Berlin and Barcelona, for example, it was laid out in the former suburbs on a grid plan, and this grid plan allowed for easy speculation as the plots were very clear and similar in size. So this led to a lot of speculation, and Mietzinshäuser or Mietskasernen were built. So basically large barracks that were then rented out as living spaces. And before the war, I think in 1905, but the year doesn't really matter, typically each person had 4 square meters to live on, because the apartments were so overfilled with people, and a lot of people couldn't afford an apartment even for a month or so, and they were called bettgeher because they just rented a bed for a night at a time. And a lot of families had to take in these bettgeher, so they would, for example, while the father was at the factory during the day and the bed was empty, they would take in a person to sleep in it during the day to help them afford their rent. And precisely the focus wasn't so much on quality of these apartments, but rather the facades as representative facades to show to the people on the street how fancy they were. And these buildings worked on a sort of vertical segregation. So you had in the bel étage, the mezzanine floor, the most beautiful apartments with high ceiling height. And then for each floor you went up, there was a lower class living there. And in the very top apartments, you had the lowest classes and also the servants
or housekeepers,
precisely.
Which is really funny because today it's exact opposite.
In many senses. And the point about the water was that these apartments were then built without running water in the apartments, and they had in the hallway, in the staircases, usually basena, which is a washing basin where you could get your water.
So introducing running water in every apartment was a revolution for itself. And besides that, like that, of course, improved the hygienic situation already, but they also installed many public baths all over the city, such as the Amalienbad, which is really beautiful. And I recommend everyone who listens to that and hasn't been there yet to once check it out, because it still exists and really is beautiful. However, I have to say it was also criticized at the time that it was made in such a extravagant way, because people oftentimes weren't feeling good, and then they're seeing those public baths, and like especially workers felt like you're building it in such a way for us to not feel welcomed here and to not feel that we have a place here. But they still exist, and like not only Amalienbad but also others. And then also there was sanatorias built for people suffering from tuberculosis or venereal diseases, what was really common at that time. And there was also a lot of critique. Like I think we always also have to mention that, especially from the Christian Social Party, they were saying that it's they wanted to go back to the old welfare system. They felt like it was that the Social Democratic Party were behaving like a mother and being too protective of their citizens and too like like watching over them and controlling them.
And this is a tension that, of course, exists until today as well in most countries, this ideological tension. And we'll also later get into the precise tensions that existed at the time, which were really pretty much at the whole time at a boiling point.
Yeah, that describes it very well. Yeah, and lastly, there was also school reform. So everyone should have access to education, and also all kinds of cultural activities like theaters, concerts, and other establishments or libraries were promoted. And something like the Wiener Festwochen is also from that time.
Ah, okay.
So, but now maybe we shall get into, more into the municipal residential housing and how that looked, and talk a little bit more about urban planning and architectural aspect of the time, which is a huge one.
Yeah.
As I said before, besides having a welfare reform as well as a reform of education and school reform, they were building a lot of municipal housing. A total of 382 municipal residential complexes were built at that time, to be precise. And they were, maybe one would think that they all looked quite uniform, but actually they were built from or designed by 199 different architects. And some of them were students of Otto Wagner, who is quite famous.
Yeah, but on the other hand, they did have a certain style as well, a representative style. A few years before, the old city walls of Vienna had been, or about 50 to 60 years before, the city walls had been torn down. And in that space, the Ringstrasse was built. And it was filled with, on the one hand, public institutions. So the parliament, the Rathaus, the city hall.
All along the Ringstrasse.
Yeah. Churches and so on, but also with palaces. From the rich merchants of the city, and parts of the Red Vienna projects were called the Ringstrasse of the proletariat, or also workers' palaces, to sort of refer to these fancy houses built by the bourgeois class.
Yeah, and that was also kind of the paradoxon that those bourgeois architects designed for people who were not so well off. But in general, one could say that the principle of Red Vienna's social policy was to improve the quality of living for everyone, and they called it a postulated social obligation to take action for those in need.
Yeah, I would say that's why we say municipal housing, because it's usually referred to today as social housing. And that is because there is a point system and there's a max wage that you can have to be allowed to live there. But it's such a wide program and so far reaching that it's not the sort of segregated case which you might imagine when you hear social housing. A lot of people, a really large part of the population, live in these buildings, and therefore we refer to it as municipal housing, as it is, as you said, Katarina, or was a matter of improving the quality for everyone.
And I think really important to mention here is that those municipal houses are spread all over Vienna. In other cities, you can see that those are more in the periphery or in districts that are not so well connected to the city center. But you can even in the old city find municipal housing, which is, or like first district, which is the most expensive, or maybe is it the 19th? I don't know. But like even in those very bourgeois districts, you find municipal housing. And I think that is really exceptional.
Yeah, and there it's interesting to note that one of the reasons for that is judged to be the fact that the territory wasn't expanded when the constitution was signed. So because there was limited space, because the city was limited to the territory it had, there was little other chance but to spread these projects out within the established city area. But Katarina, there was a point system, and still is, which determined who was allowed to live in these buildings. So maybe you want to tell us about that.
Yeah, there were three main categories: weak, medium, and strong need. And so, like, if a person was applying for a municipal flat that was, for example, homeless or injured from war, he or she would, for example, get 5 points. However, being an Austrian citizen was only worth 1 point. But then if you were born in Vienna, it was worth 4 points, which also led to a lot of critique, because it, of course, excluded a lot of people that were not born in Vienna. Mm-hmm. That still applies to today, because people being born in Vienna still have an advantage compared to people not being born in Vienna. Mm-hmm. And yeah, of course, it's heavily criticized, because who needs municipal housing is the question. Of course, there were also limits to income, but it's hard to control. And I think that is a discussion that is really hard to have, because I guess there's always gray zones how to get to municipal housing, even if you maybe don't necessarily need it. And then others can only apply after having lived in Vienna for a certain period of time, and so on. So we will talk about how the situation is today later on. But for sure we can say that there was a system, and it was not so easy to get. So there was long queues for certain municipal houses, because they were really liked. And people acknowledged that the living situations were very good there. Yeah.
Maybe you want to tell us about some of the examples of
Yeah, I would love to.
Projects that were built. Yeah?
Yes, I especially looked into Karl-Marx-Hof, because that is, I think, the most well-known and really representing that time. It's funny because it's not the first municipal housing that is being built. It's also not the largest, but it's the longest building in Europe. Yeah. So that, but it's not it doesn't, the Sandleitenhof has more apartments. That is what I meant in size. But you're right, it is
1.1 kilometers long.
Exactly, almost 1.2. And you really, if you get out the U4 Heiligenstadt, it's not a long way to go, and it's just there. And it's huge. Like, as you said, it really, it spreads out.
But I have to say, I don't think it appears as such a massive monolithic structure. It does, to me, appear rather as a series of blocks of houses.
Yeah, maybe that's also because actually only around 20% of the total area are being built on. So that is one really important thing to mention, that in total it's 156,000 square meters, and only 28,751 square meters are being built on. And all the rest is greenery, playgrounds, and as well roads. So the Karl-Marx-Hof is a courtyard structure and has several courtyards. As I said, 80% of the total area are gardens or playgrounds or other greenery and roads. And it's funny to me that you say that it's not that monumental, because the form really is, I think, especially when you look at it from above. And some even say that it reminds them of a fortress, and that's really telling in a sense that many of those municipal buildings really were city within this block. So you actually didn't have to leave it, because there was, for example, in the Karl-Marx-Hof, there was a kindergarten, as well as those former mentioned advisory centers for women, or public baths, a library, laundromats that were really a social gathering place also, a pharmacy, a post office, several clinics, as well as a coffee house. So the people didn't really have to leave it there, and they loved that. We watched one documentary where a person living there for, I don't know,
90 years.
Yeah, he was living there for a really long time. And he said when they played in the courtyard and one was calling his mom, then all the windows opened and, someone gave them some drinks or so. And I think that is so sweet. And you can really imagine the atmosphere there, because everyone was caring for each other. Yeah. And they all knew each other, I guess, and it must have been really fun to live there. Yeah, so more theoretical stuff maybe. The Karl-Marx-Hof was designed by the architect Karl Ehn, and it was built in 3 phases between 1926 and then 1930 it was finished. And the opening of the Karl-Marx-Hof was also quite
ceremonial.
Yeah, one could say. And the mayor of Vienna at that time, Karl Seitz, said, now I'm translating it from German, of course, but he said, once we will no longer be, those stones will speak for us. And they really do. Mm-hmm. I mean, many parts of Karl-Marx-Hof were destroyed during World War II, but it was rebuilt afterwards. And now it really does. The stones still speak for them, one could say, and it still represents the time of Red Vienna as possibly no other municipal residential complex. Not only super interesting for people interested in this period of time or architecture, but really also attracts tourists from all over the world, because it is a really special building complex. And some flats were merged because they were, for the needs of today, too small. So today there are 1,272 flats, and originally there were 1,382 apartments. So a bit fewer, and at that time they were designated for around 5,000 people. Today we're talking about around 2.2 people per apartment. So also funny to see how many more people lived in the apartments at that time.
Mm-hmm. As we mentioned, the Siedlerbewegungen earlier.
Those wild settlements.
Yeah, precisely. I think it is important to mention them as a sort of alternative to this top-down planning by the municipality. We have the same sort of parallel approaches today, I would say, in this dichotomy of top-down and bottom-up planning. So for that time, the wild settlements could be seen as bottom-up, because they, during the First World War, moved into the forests surrounding Vienna and cut down trees that didn't belong to them, that were in private possession, and built houses freely just to survive. There was then, however, as mentioned already, a sort of official recognition of these. There were movements demonstrating for this recognition, as the conditions were so dire. And finally, the municipality and the mayor of the city did recognize them. And with that came also support, and there was the gazebo formed, a sort of city-run company that supplied materials for the building of these buildings, and that still exists today, the gazebo. There was also this sort of policy of the muscle loan, the Muskelhypotheke, that you could, if you didn't have money, as these people didn't, you could work on the building site, and a certain amount of work would, in essence, pay for you living there, which I think is a very interesting and to me seems quite fair.
It reminds me of those buildings that are now proposed in South America, where only half of the building is being built and the other half is kind of leftover space for when the people have more money.
Proposed. I mean, they are built already, even by Alejandro Aravena, the architect of Elemental. Yeah, those are interesting approaches to situations where there isn't necessarily the political or financial possibility of supplying social housing, but you still have to find a way to provide some sort of housing.
Yeah, I think that's important to mention, that when the city kind of legalized those wild settlements, the first approach was also to have municipal buildings in that form, kind of. But then at some point they figured out that they didn't have enough space for of areas that were like together, and that they would achieve more housing with building those super blocks. Schmelz is, for example, a settlement
kind of
that
these
time.
Garden city-like areas with smaller houses.
Yeah, and then you have to think about the garden city of Ebenezer Howard. That was also that was the planning ideology of that time. And what I didn't mention before, this Licht, Luft, Sonne, so light, air, and sun, to get that to the people. And therefore you can also understand why they were building those courtyards and really putting an emphasis on having light for the people and having green space for the people.
Yeah. As obviously the buildings built before then in the old city, but also really largely through the speculation in the 19th century, had at most light wells, not proper courtyards. And this was according to the building rules at the time, which at first actually didn't have any rules, and then were reformed and said you have to have so and so many square meters left over on the building site. But that meant that really a lot of the site could be filled with building. And there really wasn't a lot of light. Those were very dense developments.
Now we were kind of getting out of the chronological order, but kind of having a side story of the Siedlerbewegungen. But let's go back to Red Vienna. How did it end?
Well, as mentioned before, it is considered to have lasted between 1920 and 1934. And the year 1934 is important, not just for the end of Red Vienna, but in fact for the end of the First Republic of Austria, as Austria became a dictatorship, even before the Anschluss by Hitler and Nazi Germany. But that development had been prepared for by certain events leading up to it. So the tensions that we've mentioned between the Social Democratic Vienna and the mostly conservative rest of Austria had continued to rise in this time. Each political side had paramilitary groups attached to them. There was the Republican Defense League of the Social Democrats, and they stood opposite the Homeland Protection, as well as other forces from the conservative and nationalist camps. The World War I peace treaty of Saint-Germain and Laye, there was a separate peace treaty, so it's not the Treaty of Versailles that is most well known, because that was just the Treaty of Germany. But as explained earlier, Austria decided to end the alliance with Germany and sign their own peace deal. And this peace treaty, similarly to the Treaty of Versailles, limited the size of the Austrian army so that they could not instigate any more wars. So the size was limited to 30,000 men, which is a very small size. There were fears that that was not enough to protect Austria if they were to be attacked. And so partly for that reason, the different political sides formed their own armed paramilitary groups to be able to defend the country in the case of an attack. But not only for that, but also to advance their ideologies with force and the presentation of force. So, for example, the stated purpose of the Republican Defense League was to protect the Republic and its constitution, and to support the national army and police in keeping public peace and order, as well as to support public events of the Social Democratic Party. It took part in political marches and protected workers' strikes. Its opposites, the Homeland Protection, and also other groups such as from the early 30s onwards, the SA and the SS, openly called for the abolition of democracy in favor of authoritarian rule. They wanted back to the time of the emperor. On January 30th in 1927, one of the worst clashes between the Defense League and a conservative nationalist group of frontline veterans, which were called Frontkämpfer, took place in Schattendorf. During a march of the Defense League, they were fired upon by frontline veterans, and one child and one adult were killed. The three shooters were freed from all charges by the court, and the wrath of the working class erupted. They saw it as a class justice and could not believe that these murderers were acquitted. And so on July 15th, huge crowds gathered in the city center of Vienna to protest, and a general strike was called throughout the whole country. The Palace of Justice in Vienna was set on fire by the crowds, and police killed 94 people and injured over 1,000. In other parts of the country, the Homeland Protection broke the general strike. The paramilitary forces on both sides increased their preparations, and the Defense League considered the government now to be on the side of the enemy. Clashes between them became more intense, and the Homeland Protection of the state of Styria under Walter Frimer initiated a coup d'etat. They marched on Vienna to take power of the entire country, but were stopped by the Republican Defense League and the National Army. But the army were purposefully slow to react. They let the Homeland Protection disperse and hide, and also hide their weapons, because in the end they were on the same side and opposed to the Social Democratic Party. And the court process that followed was just a sham. All the leaders of the coup were acquitted. And more the Republican Defense League was persecuted by the government. There were house searches where they seized the weapons of the Republican Defense League, and they also stopped them from carrying out marches with the Social Democratic Party. After Engelbert Dollfuss became chancellor in 1932, this persecution intensified, and the Defense League was forbidden entirely from gathering. In March 1933, Dollfuss took advantage of issues with proceedings in parliament, and he declared it unable to function and therefore defunct. This was de facto the beginning of the dictatorship. Dollfuss used a 1917 emergency law from the First World War to abolish the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, and other constitutional rights. The Republican Defense League was outlawed and members were arrested. The Fatherland Front, the Vaterländische Front, was founded as a unity party to rule as a one-party government, incorporating the Christian Social Party and the Homeland Protection Party, the Heimatblock, into one party.
But so where was the Social Democratic Party then? The
Social Democratic Party hadn't been banned yet, as it wasn't as easy as banning the Republican Defense League, as they weren't an armed wing. but its members were persecuted. There were razzias and arrests by the police and the army in the Social Democratic Party. And the goal of the government was to provoke a violent uprising by the Social Democratic Party. And then this would be quelled by the army and by the Homeland Protection. And they succeeded in that. They continued the persecutions and arrests until in February 1934, a group of Defense League members in Linz tried to stop a search for weapons in the Social Democratic Party headquarters in the Hotel Schiff. And that was the start of the Austrian Civil War. It's also known as the February uprisings, the Februarkämpfe.
And also Karl-Marx-Hof played an important role there, right?
Yeah.
Or really was...
It did, absolutely. So we'll get to that because the Republican Defense League fought against the army and the police, and a general strike was called. But the Defense League and the Social Democrats had already been weakened through the persecution and arrests in the years prior. So the general strike failed very quickly. Not that many even took part, and few of the Defense League took part in the uprising, in the battles. The battles were mostly fought in working class districts of Vienna, Linz, and some other smaller cities. And the army bombarded the positions of the Defense League with artillery. So including the buildings of Red Vienna, where they had built up their strongholds and used as fortresses, as you alluded to in the aesthetics of the buildings earlier. The Karl-Marx-Hof, the Reumannhof, and the Sandleitenhof were among the buildings bombarded and heavily fought for. The Social Democratic Party was in the following days banned, finally, and its organizations as well as unions were also banned. And 9 people were executed after these struggles. Some party leaders fled the country, and Karl Seitz, the mayor with those famous words on the Karl-Marx-Hof, was arrested. And that was the end of Red Vienna, but it was also the end of democracy in Austria. The battles ended on February 15th, so just 3 days after they started. And the government claimed that about 314 people were killed and 800 wounded, but those numbers are likely way too low. It was likely in the thousands. The artillery bombardment in Vienna, in particular, is estimated to have taken the lives of 250 to 270 civilians. And even Hitler, who by then was dictator in Germany, was critical of that, saying that Chancellor Dollfuss had, with criminal stupidity, had women and children shot. In July of the same year, Austrian National Socialists attempted a coup d'etat, which failed, but Dollfuss was killed in the attempt. And his replacement was Kurt Schuschnigg, who would rule as dictator and leader of the Fatherland Front until the Anschluss by Nazi Germany in 1938.
Thinking about municipal housing, was there any construction during World War II?
No. There were a few buildings built after the February struggles, but not within the Red Vienna program. And during World War II, there weren't really any buildings built.
Yeah, actually, super many were destroyed, of course, and had to be reconstructed afterwards. And I guess there was a huge pressure to build up those housings very fast because, yet again, super many people were homeless and injured from war, terrible conditions. One could say that after 1945, a new era for municipal housing has begun. Also with a different style, and I guess we can get into that a little bit, but maybe we can mention the first large building project, which was the Per Albin Hansson Siedlung. Maybe you want to say why it was called like that.
Well, Sweden helped Austria after the First World War as well, but also after the Second World War, and helped them financially, but also sent them machines, Swedish machines, which were able to use bricks from destroyed buildings to produce new bricks, which helped a lot in the in the rebuilding of Vienna.
Yeah.
And Per Albin Hansson was the prime minister of Sweden during the war.
Yes.
And for a couple of years after it until he died.
But contrary to the period of the Red Vienna before the Second World War, they were mainly building those kept buildings and not so much those super blocks anymore. And oftentimes they were also called Emmentaler Bauten. Emmentaler is this cheese, this rectangular.
And has a lot of holes. Right?
Yeah, but also because people felt that they weren't so characteristic anymore. There was no architectural finesse and just producing housing actually. And also,
it was, of course, also a different era in architecture, a different zeitgeist. So it was the beginning of the era of like economical functionalism or constructional logic, of a focus on building cheap and building fast with like systems of construction.
And also the spirit of having a city within these blocks was completely lost, because maybe those new municipal buildings were arranged around important infrastructure like supermarkets or whatever, but it wasn't anymore that there were all those institutions within the blocks, that the people didn't actually have to leave the complexes.
Yeah, of course, it was rather the era of the Charter of Athens, which proposed the split of functions. So you have one place where you live, you have one place where you work, you have one place for center activities or functions.
And around those places you go by car.
Yeah.
And how is it looking today? Shall we cover that as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is important. Yeah.
We tackled it a little bit before, but actually Vienna is really proud being the biggest communal house owner in Europe, because they manage around 220,000 municipal flats and around 500,000 people, which equals around every fourth Viennese person living in municipal housing, which is a lot. And I guess even though Vienna can be really proud of how many people live in municipal buildings, and therefore living is actually still affordable in Vienna, one always has to be, I don't know, trying to get better, or also continue to make housing affordable, because it can go really quickly that it goes in another way, where suddenly we're in a situation where we are in many capitals of the world in Europe, especially where housing is not affordable at all. And there's also a lack of housing options.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that a main difference between the municipal housing of Vienna of today and the Red Vienna period is that the housing of the Red Vienna period was financed mainly by specific taxes, and those Breitner taxes that we spoke about aren't possible today, politically speaking. So a different system is used of subsidies. So a lot of the housing that is built is not built directly by the city or the municipality, but rather by private building companies who have to take part in competitions. So the city has sites around the city and stages competitions for the right to build on those sites. And for that, they have particular conditions that must be met in terms of now the Fäsäulen, so the 4 pillars of sustainability. And then the winner builds and is subsidized to a certain degree to be able to build and keep the rents low. And I think that can be questioned as well, because in the end, it's tax money subsidizing private activity. And they are then, not so that they can take out as much profit as they want. That is also then regulated, but still this, as we mentioned in the episode about gentrification, also in particular for Vienna and its renovation projects, to question this method of using subsidies. So that's mainly how the municipal housing of Vienna is built today. And there was a period of, I think, 15 to 20 years where no Gemeindebauten were built. So buildings built directly by the municipality. They've started that up again as the Gemeindebauten neu. And it will be interesting to see how well that will work.
Yeah, but as I said before, there's still requirements one has to fulfill when applying for municipal housing. And today that is managed by the so-called Vienna housing ticket, so Wiener Wohnticket. And it's like the entrance ticket to the entire housing offer of Vienna. And you have to have a minimum age of 17 years. And as I said before, you have to continuously have lived in Vienna for 2 years. You also have to have an Austrian citizenship or equivalent, which already, of course, all those requirements already exclude a lot of people and therefore can be discussed.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, an equivalent is, for example, to be a citizen of an EU state. But even so, it's actually not even just 2 years of residence in Vienna. It's 2 years of continuous residence on one address, which makes it particularly difficult because if you move to Vienna, you can't get into the social housing yet. Maybe you take any flat you can find. It's also quite common to live in student cooperatives, Wohngemeinschaften or WGs, and you usually don't live in those or are able to live in them for 2 years continuously. Rather, you move around in different apartments and you never reach this status of 2 continuous years so that you're able to apply for a subsidized apartment. So there's definitely this, as there was in the Red Vienna period, barrier absolutely to outsiders.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's other requirements, such as, like, I only listed some now, but also, of course, there's a maximum income limit, and you shouldn't have any concerns regarding tenancy law or have, they say, clarified family circumstances. And additionally, you will have to have one more specific reason for needing housing, such as being, for example, a single parent or having an age-related or illness-related housing need. So there are those different requirements.
Which can also even be I would say, not because of the requirements in themselves, but it can be criticized, this entire model of social housing, because it can lead to a stigmatization of the people who live there. It becomes very clear that they are people of a lower class needing help of the state, which can also have a segregating tendency. And as the buildings were built, spread out through Vienna during Red Vienna, there has been traditionally very little segregation in Vienna, but it is rising as far as I know.
Yeah, but Sonnenwendviertel, for example, is also with a lot of municipal buildings, and that is really at the city center, I would say.
Sure, that's one. On the one hand, that is one example, but as we've already established, it's not that easy to get a subsidized apartment, and in the end, quite a few people also live in apartments rented on the private market. And such a project as Sonnenwendviertel, which is a quite huge urban planning project, then carries the risk of gentrifying that area, which is one of the poorest, if not the poorest, districts of Vienna.
Okay, so I think we have come to an end and pretty much covered the main events.
Yeah, there's still a lot to say about Red Vienna, and a lot of interesting things to read, which so I recommend a Googling of it. There was so much going on at the time For example, particularly interesting to me is also the graphic design language that was used by the Social Democratic Party and their surrounding.
So then thank you for listening.
And tell us what you want to hear more about and what you think of the topic. And let's talk about cities.